Against d4, if you're looking for an uncompromising, fighting defense, inviting sharp complications from the beginning of the game, then the Grunfeld is an excellent choice to explore. The Grunfeld is characterized by striking in the center on the third move with d5. Let's see how we reach this typical Grunfeld position from the beginning. When white opens the game with d4, instead of claiming a fair share of space in the center with d5, black decides to develop a piece while controlling the center with knight f6, allowing white to take more space with c4. We mentioned that the Grunfeld arises after black plays d5 on the third move. What happens if black decides to play d5 on the second move? Black typically wants a knight on c3 before playing the move d5. In this case, by playing d5 one move too early, white can simply take over the center with c takes d5. If black plays queen takes d5, then white will gain time with knight c3, attacking black's queen, and preparing to take over the center with e4. If black decides to play knight takes d5, white typically plays knight f3, supporting the center while preparing to grab more central space with e4, when white enjoys a healthy two-pawn center without having to make any serious concessions in the process. Instead of playing the premature d5, it's important for black to remain flexible with g6. White's most common response is knight c3, developing a piece while preparing e4. If black continues with bishop g7, this leads to the king's Indian defense after e4, another sharp defense that black may consider. Instead of bishop g7, we enter the dynamic Grunfeld with the disruptive pawn thrust, d5, striking in the center, adding pressure against white's pawn on c4. This provocative move invites white to build a broad center after the natural exchange c takes d5 and knight takes d5, allowing white to grab more space in the center with e4. Although white enjoys a central space advantage, now that white has a knight on c3, it comes at a price after knight takes c3, b takes c3. In order to achieve the desirable two-pawn center, white has accepted an isolated pawn on a2, and more importantly, a backward c3 pawn. This pawn does help support the key d4 square, but since it cannot be protected by pawns, this will be a target for black's pieces. The great debate in the Grunfeld is whether this central pawn mass will prove a long-term strength for white, especially as it advances and takes more space, or if it will become more of a liability as black's piece play against it intensifies. There is no definite verdict, so let's take a look at some of the basic ideas for both sides. Black begins to add pressure against white's center with bishop g7, developing the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal, adding pressure against d4, a key battleground in this opening, as well as x-raying the backward c3 pawn. A natural and strong move for white is knight f3, developing a piece while supporting the center. The central counterattack intensifies with the key Grunfeld pawn break, c5. Notice that capturing the pawn with d takes c5 loses material immediately to bishop takes c3 check, forking the king and rook. White has several good options to challenge black, but let's first see what happens if white focuses on automatic development and simply doesn't pay attention to black's ideas. If white plays a move such as bishop d3, this natural-looking move is not a desirable choice for white, especially as it blocks the queen's protection of the sensitive d4 pawn. It's essential for black not to get overly eager to win a pawn with c takes d4, c takes d4, as this would lead to disaster after bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and queen takes d4, allowing white to play the deadly bishop b5 check, discovering the queen's attack against its counterpart, so white will win the queen on the next turn. Rather than falling for this trap, black can increase the pressure against d4 with knight c6. White naturally responds by defending the center with bishop e3, allowing black to indirectly increase the pressure against d4 with bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, a key defender of the d4 pawn. Notice that although white has two pawns occupying the center of the board, black's pieces control the center from a distance, and white's center is on the verge of collapse. Black is ready to play bishop takes f3, removing a key defender, when c takes d4 will win a pawn and destroy white's center. If white tries to block the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the center with e5, black can gain a strong position with the instructive sequence c takes d4, c takes d4. Black has turned the backward c3 pawn into a backward d pawn, which also opens up the diagonal against the enemy king, so black can play queen a5 check. If white responds with bishop d2, then black will centralize the queen with queen d5, enjoying a strong and active position against white's compromised center. Instead of bishop d2, white can also play queen d2, allowing a trade of queens with queen takes d2. White's minor pieces are trying to keep the d4 pawn safe, so after king takes d2. Centralizing the king isn't always as crazy as it looks, but in this case white's center is in serious trouble after rook d8. Notice that although white has two pawns in the center, it is actually black who controls the center. Black enjoys tremendous piece pressure against white's vulnerable, in this case overextended center, which is the dream scenario for black in the Grunfeld. One plan may be to castle the king and double the rooks on the d-file, intensifying pressure against the d4 pawn. This is definitely a situation white will want to avoid. Playing bishop d3 does not complement white's decision to play knight f3. With proper play, however, knight f3 can be a dangerous weapon against the Grunfeld. Bishop e3 is a solid way to continue. The disruptive bishop b5 check can be explored. And another dynamic option for white is rook b1. White takes advantage of the fact that there is no longer a pawn on b2, adding pressure against the b7 pawn. So black has to decide how to handle this tension before developing the light-squared bishop. This move does create a loose pawn on a2, which white is often willing to sacrifice. Rook b1 also vacates the dangerous long dark-squared diagonal, which is especially important if black plays knight c6. This is a perfectly natural move in most Grunfeld positions, but black has to be careful regarding tricky move orders. Since the rook is on b1, this allows white to play the powerful response d5, grabbing more space in the center while attacking black's knight. White is building a comfortable initiative, so if black does not capture the c3 pawn, this may be later used to support white's large center with a timely c4. And if black decides to play bishop takes c3 check, white sacrifices the pawn in order to eliminate black's Grunfeld bishop after bishop d2. Since the knight on c6 is hanging, black is forced to agree to the trade with bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2. For the temporary price of a single pawn, white dominates the center, has a strong lead in development with active pieces, and most importantly, black's dark squares are quite weak, making kingside castling a dangerous choice for black. The rook on b1 reminds black that the queenside is also far from secure. You know it's not a good sign if black's best move is to return the pawn immediately with knight d4, followed by castling on the weakened kingside, so this is a line black should definitely avoid. Instead of knight c6, black typically decides to castle the king. We reach a critical position after the modest-looking bishop e2. White sensibly develops and prepares to castle. If black doesn't play energetically, white will enjoy a comfortable position, so black can challenge white's setup with c takes d4, c takes d4. The exchange of pawns allows black to play the disruptive queen a5 check, forking the king and a2 pawn. White can offer an exchange of queens with queen d2, but if white wants to seek a sharper game, then we will see bishop d2, sacrificing a pawn after queen takes a2, followed by castling the king. White has sacrificed a pawn, and to make matters worse, black has two connected passed pawns on the queen side. This may look like a questionable line for white, but practice has proven that this is a fully sound gambit and is a serious try against the Grunfeld. What exactly is white's compensation? White enjoys a strong center, as well as a healthy lead in development. The rook on b1 adds serious pressure against the b7 pawn, so if black plays the natural and popular bishop g4, not only can white centralize the bishop and support the center with bishop e3, white can also invade black's queenside with rook takes b7, creating interesting play. If black decides to hold on to the pawn for the time being by spending an important tempo on b6, then white can play the crafty queen c1, creating a queen-bishop battery on the dark squares, as well as preparing to harass black's queen with bishop c4. That being said, black does not have any obvious weaknesses, and this is not an easy structure for white to break down. We are merely scratching the surface of this fascinating line, so there is plenty of scope to explore Grandmaster games and see how some of these lines are expressed in practice. Instead of playing knight f3, another popular idea is demonstrated by former world champion Vladimir Kramnik, bishop c4. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal, pointing directly at f7, and later it may support the advance of the d4 pawn to d5. His opponent, Grandmaster Peter Svidler, a player well known for his expertise as black in the Grunfeld, played the thematic counterstrike, c5. Instead of developing the knight to f3, Kramnik decides to develop it to the e2 square. protecting the d4 and c3 pawns on the long diagonal and preparing to respond to bishop g4, pinning the knight, with f3. Black continues to develop and increases the pressure against d4 with knight c6. Black is not fearful of d5, as black can play knight a5, attacking the light-squared bishop and preparing to support a future space-gaining c4, clamping down on the light squares. Kramnik continues to develop and supports the center with bishop e3. Kramnik and Svidler have had several battles in the Grunfeld, and in this particular game, Svidler decides to play the committal exchange c takes d4, c takes d4. Removing the weak c3 pawn from the board is not a decision to take lightly, as white's center remains intact, and black cannot easily add more pressure against it. Svidler's idea is to open up a diagonal against the enemy king, allowing queen a5 check. Kramnik decides to challenge black's queen with bishop d2. Svidler decided to test Kramnik's ambitions with queen d8. Adding pressure against the d4 pawn and offering a repetition of moves after bishop e3. Kramnik declares that his intentions are anything but peaceful with the dynamic pawn advance, d5. White's d-pawn is a key target for black in the Grunfeld, but as it advances forward, it can also prove to be a thorn in black's side. The pawn attacks the knight and also offers the rook on a1 to black's bishop, which should not be accepted because after bishop takes a1. Queen takes a1. After surrendering the dark squares, black's rook on h8 is hanging, and black's knight on c6 is also in trouble. When white's active bishop pair, safer king, and superior development will overwhelm black's defenses. In the game, Svidler centralized the knight with knight e5, attacking the light-squared bishop. Kramnik pinned black's knight to the bishop with bishop c3. So black removed this annoying pin by castling. Now that the light-squared bishop is truly hanging, white retreated this piece to safety with bishop b3. And if white is able to safely support the advance of these pawns with space-gaining moves such as f4 and e5, black can be slowly squeezed off the board. Sensing the urgency in this position, Grandmaster Svidler played queen b6, adding pressure down the diagonal, trying to discourage white from playing f4. The Grunfeld is a sharp, uncompromising opening, so Kramnik carefully considered the position and boldly advanced with his plan anyway, f4. It turns out that black's most solid option was knight d7, but Svidler played the tempting knight lunge, knight g4, trying to exploit the weakened dark squares around the enemy king. Kramnik anticipated this and played bishop d4. White is slowly neutralizing black's active pieces, and as black's counterplay disappears, white's strong central bind increases in strength. Svidler did not want to voluntarily surrender his so-called Grunfeld bishop on g7, so he initiated a queen exchange with queen a5 check, queen d2, queen takes d2 check, king takes d2. Allowing a trade of queens and centralizing the king is not an uncommon theme in the Grunfeld for white. In fact, the king can be well placed in the endgame, preparing to support the central pawns if necessary. Black decided to strike back in the center, discouraging a trade of dark-squared bishops with e5. Hoping to stabilize the center and preparing to return the wayward knight on g4 to active duty after f takes e5 and knight takes e5. Playing e5 is a serious positional concession, as this creates a dangerous passed d-pawn for white. Even though white's dark-squared bishop is under attack, Kramnik refuses to react to black's ideas and plays the instructive counterstrike, h3. If black retreats the knight, then e5 will simply fall, so the game continued e takes d4, h takes g4. White's central dominance increases, inviting black to capture the g4 pawn when white is ready to march forward with e5. We can summarize the position after understanding black's disruptive pawn thrust, g5, trying to break up white's central pawn mass to prevent e5. But instead of ruining the structure, Kramnik calmly responded with g3, reinforcing the f4 pawn when Svidler played bishop takes g4. Kramnik cemented his incredible positional advantage with e5. White may be down a pawn for the time being, but the dangerous passed d-pawn more than compensates for this minor material deficit. This is a dream Grunfeld scenario for white. The passed d-pawn soon advanced to d6, when Kramnik's powerful central pawns, supported by white's light-squared bishop, and soon-to-be centralized rook on d1, proved too much for black to handle. In spite of being a world-class Grunfeld expert, Grandmaster Svidler resigned a hopeless position in only 8 more moves. As we can see, the fate of many Grunfeld games rests on whether white's central pawn structure can withstand black's dynamic counterplay, and if it does, black can land in serious trouble. Instead of playing c takes d4, a more popular choice is to castle. White has some interesting choices, including removing the rook from the dangerous long diagonal and supporting the c-file with rook c1. The adventurous h4, preparing a flank attack with h5 is another interesting option, but White's most traditional response is to castle. As is the case in most Grunfeld lines, there's no shortage of ideas to explore, including the thematic queen c7, aligning with the loose bishop on c4, and preparing to add more pressure against White's center with rook d8. Black may consider playing b6, offering an interesting, as well as sound pawn sacrifice seen in many high-level Grandmaster games. Another option for black is to continue with the theme of using piece play to add pressure against White's center with bishop g4. Pinning the knight on e2, so this indirectly adds more pressure against the d4 pawn the knight was protecting. This move provokes White into playing f3. Bishop d7 is certainly an option to consider, but black's traditional response has been the active knight a5. Attacking White's light-squared bishop, the interested viewer can explore bishop takes f7 check, known as the Seville variation, which was famously debated by world champions Kasparov and Karpov and is still occasionally played. But White is typically preferred to play bishop d3, reinforcing the center when black's threatened bishop, as well as offside knight on a5 do not leave a good impression. The concrete play of the Grunfeld is expressed after another counter-attacking move, c takes d4. Attacking White's dark-squared bishop when after c takes d4. By chasing White's light-squared bishop away from the c4 square, black is able to use a good retreating square for the light-squared bishop with bishop e6, preparing to support knight c4 on the next move. White sometimes responds to this by playing rook c1, continuing to focus on efficient development and offering a pawn sacrifice with bishop takes a2. White can play in even more direct fashion with d5, attacking the light-squared bishop while grabbing more space, inviting black to win in exchange after bishop takes a1. Queen takes a1. In exchange for the material, White enjoys a strong pawn center and control of the dark squares, which is especially important as black has given up its key defender of the king, the dark-squared bishop. If black moves the bishop to safety with bishop d7, then bishop h6 is an unpleasant response, threatening both the rook on f8 as well as checkmate on g7. Instead of retreating the bishop, black usually takes advantage of the pinned d5 pawn and plays f6, trying to close the long diagonal when White typically adds pressure against black's kingside dark squares with bishop h6. Attacking the rook, so black sensibly responds with rook e8. We've reached a typically complex Grunfeld scenario. In this case, black is up material, but has a weakened king and somewhat scattered pieces. White enjoys a powerful center, relatively safer king, especially after playing king h1. White has tended to demonstrate better practical results, but black is certainly not without some chances as well. We've examined some of the typical ideas in the Grunfeld, but it's important to mention that although knight c3 is the most popular, as well as straightforward response for White, moves such as g3, as well as knight f3 must be kept in mind. It's important not to play d5 automatically, as White can play c takes d5, and without a knight on c3, prepare a quick e4 without making any serious concessions. Instead of striking in the center immediately, a good idea is to remain flexible with bishop g7. White can play g3, preparing a kingside fianchetto, when black can remain flexible by castling, possibly preparing to play lines from the king's Indian defense based upon d6. Or black may decide to play c6, preparing the typical Grunfeld pawn thrust d5. And since White's light-squared bishop is now committed to g2, attacking c4 with the trademark Grunfeld move d5 is not out of the question. Let's finish our initial journey in the Grunfeld by examining a challenging line White may employ after knight c3. Once the knight is on c3, this is a great signal to confidently play d5. Instead of transposing into the main lines of the exchange variation with c takes d5, White may consider natural developing moves such as bishop f4 or g5. But White can also play the challenging queen b3. White's idea is to increase pressure against d5, preparing to play c takes d5, without allowing black to play knight takes d5 and compromising White's pawn structure with knight takes c3. It's not out of the question to support the center with c6, but black's most promising defense is the active d takes c4, queen takes c4. After black castles, White is able to create the ideal pawn center with e4. Unlike the main lines we examined, white's knight on c3 remains active, so black has not compromised white's pawn structure. Although this does look quite good for white, in order to achieve this position, white's queen has spent time developing to a somewhat exposed square. Two of black's common responses include the a6 square. Black can play a6, preparing to grab space and attack white's queen with b5. Another idea is to play knight a6, preparing the key c5 pawn break without blocking the light-squared bishop. The provocative knight c6 is another option to explore, but one classical response is bishop g4. This is known as the Smyslov variation, indirectly adding pressure against white's center by attacking the knight on f3. White typically responds with bishop e3, reinforcing the center and inviting black to surrender the bishop pair with bishop takes f3, when white is not afraid to compromise the structure to help support the center pawns with g takes f3. Instead, black's active dark square strategy continues with the strange-looking but instructive response knight f to d7, unleashing the dark squared bishop's pressure against the center, as well as potentially preparing c5 or e5 pawn breaks. Another idea is to play knight b6, attacking white's queen, and then developing the other knight to c6, adding pressure against d4, when the exchange bishop takes f3, removing a key defender of the d4 pawn, is not an uncommon idea. White may anticipate knight b6 with queen b3, adding pressure against b7, while also clearing the f1 to a6 diagonal for white's light-squared bishop. Another option is to reinforce the center with rook d1, when once again we see the classic theme of white enjoying a space advantage with two pawns occupying the center, while black energetically fights to break down the center with active piece play. As is the case in many Grunfeld positions, both sides can expect their fair share of interesting chances in a sharp middle game struggle. The Grunfeld is a dynamic defense against d4, often accepting a space disadvantage by allowing white a broad central pawn structure. In exchange, black will energetically fight against white's center, promising active counterplay that produces incredibly complex play. Thanks for exploring this uncompromising system, and best of luck if you decide to challenge or defend the Grunfeld in your next game, right here on chess.com.